Before we begin, tell me, where in the world are you watching from, and what time has found you? The most existentially disturbing entity in the Cthulhu Mythos was never meant to be encountered. It arrived instead as a condition, not a being with desires or domain, but a principle woven into cosmic architecture, a rule of existence that renders concepts like threat or antagonist embarrassingly inadequate. Not something that destroys, something that reveals destruction and creation as equally meaningless categories. This isn't an entity that offers conflict. In the deepest strata of the mythos, this presence doesn't oppose humanity or consciousness. It exists in a framework where opposition requires mutual recognition, and recognition requires existing on comparable planes of reality. We don't. It doesn't notice us the way we don't notice the specific arrangement of atoms in yesterday's breath. Lovecraft and his circle understood this. The old ones are frightening because they're vast and powerful. But the truly disturbing entity is the one that makes vastness and power seem like human obsessions. Quaint metrics that assume a universe organized around hierarchies we can comprehend. This presence operates under logic so alien that our categories of being dissolve in its proximity. Consider this. Azathoth and Nyarlathotep are famous because we can assign them roles. Creator, messenger, destroyer. The most disturbing entity has no role. It isn't part of the story. It's the medium the story is written in, and the medium is aware in ways that make awareness the wrong word entirely. Tonight we examine not the monster at reality's center, but the recognition that reality doesn't have a center. It has a substrate, and that substrate operates on principles that predate and supersede causality, identity, and comprehensibility itself. And perhaps we'll understand the deepest dread. This entity isn't waiting to be summoned or awakened. It's already the condition of existence. You've been inside it your entire life. Every thought you've had has been a pattern. It's been sustaining until the moment it stops. Let us look at what exists beneath the threshold of being. Howard Phillips Lovecraft operated from a specific philosophical position between 1926 and 1937, the period when his cosmic mythology cohered into systematic dread. His letters reveal a writer consciously engineering horror from materialist premises rather than supernatural tradition. In correspondence with fellow writer James F. Morton in 1923, Lovecraft described the universe as a blind cosmos grinding aimlessly toward no particular goal. This wasn't Gothic pessimism or romantic despair. This was mechanistic cosmicism, the conviction that human consciousness emerged as cosmic accident in a universe governed by physical laws indifferent to meaning, purpose, or survival. The philosophical framework mattered because it determined which entities could disturb at existential depth. Traditional horror posited evil forces that opposed good, supernatural beings that violated natural law, monsters that threatened human bodies or souls. Lovecraft's innovation was recognizing that genuine cosmic dread required entities that made those categories irrelevant. Not beings that break physical laws, but beings for whom our physical laws represent local anomalies in larger frameworks we lack the cognitive architecture to process. This distinction separates frightening monsters from philosophically devastating principles. Consider the timeline of Lovecraft's intellectual development. By 1919, he had abandoned the last vestiges of supernatural belief, declaring himself a mechanistic materialist, influenced by Haeckel's monism and Huxley's evolutionary naturalism. The astronomical discoveries of the 1920s, Edwin Hubble's expanding universe, the true scale of galactic distances, the recognition that Earth occupied no privileged position, provided scientific scaffolding for cosmic insignificance. Lovecraft absorbed these revelations voraciously, writing in 1926 that all my tales are based on the fundamental premise that common human laws and interests and emotions have no validity or significance in the vast cosmos at large. This wasn't nihilistic posturing. This was conscious artistic strategy. Lovecraft designed his most disturbing entity to embody mechanistic indifference at cosmic scale, rejecting the Gothic tradition where supernatural forces acknowledged humanity enough to threaten it. True horror, he argued, emerged when humans confronted intelligences or principles so alien that human existence registered as background noise, not worth opposing, not worth acknowledging, operating under logic where concepts like worth dissolved into meaninglessness. The famous opening of The Call of Cthulhu in 1926 articulated this precisely. The merciful inability of the human mind to correlate its contents, and the implication that complete understanding would shatter sanity or reveal sanity itself as provincial construct. Yet Lovecraft's personal correspondence reveals awareness that even his great old ones represented compromise. Cthulhu could be described, imagined, opposed. Nyarlathotep performed actions and pursued goals. These entities frightened because they were powerful and alien, but they still operated within frameworks of agency, intention, location. The truly disturbing presence emerged in fragments across the mythology, referenced obliquely, described inadequately, existing less as character than as condition. Not Azathoth, the entity, but what Azathoth represented, a cosmos where mind and mindlessness occupy the same ontological position, where the difference between creation and entropy collapses, where the governing principle of reality operates below the threshold of what operating could mean. Lovecraft's letters from 1930 onward show increasing frustration with the limitations of narrative fiction. Stories required protagonists who acted, conflicts that developed, resolutions that provided closure. But the most disturbing cosmic truth resisted dramatization precisely because it offered no conflict, only recognition that human categories of conflict assume a universe organized around tension and resolution. What disturbed most couldn't be encountered in a story. It could only be the medium the story occurred within, and the moment of recognizing that medium's true nature constituted the horror. This wasn't a being humans could fight or flee. This was the substrate of existence, and the recognition that substrate operated under principles that made existence the wrong category entirely. The bridge to understanding what Lovecraft created requires examining what he rejected, what he absorbed, and what philosophical traditions he inverted, to construct horror from epistemological collapse rather than supernatural threat. Lovecraft's cosmic horror emerged from specific 19th century philosophical ruptures that dismantled anthropocentric cosmology. Arthur Schopenhauer's The World as Will and Representation, 1818, proposed a universe driven by blind, purposeless will, not divine intelligence orchestrating toward good ends, but mindless striving that generated consciousness as accidental byproduct. Schopenhauer's universe contained no inherent meaning, no cosmic justice, no trajectory toward improvement. Human reason and emotion represented local phenomena, evolutionary adaptations with no significance beyond survival function. This framework appears throughout Lovecraft's mythology, entities that embody pure principle rather than personality, forces that operate without intention or awareness, a cosmos where consciousness emerges as cosmic aberration rather than divine gift. Nietzsche extended this dissolution in The Gay Science, 1882, and thus spoke Zarathustra, 1883, declaring God's death and interrogating what remained when theological meaning structures collapsed. His response, the Übermensch creating values in meaningless universe, held no appeal for Lovecraft, but the diagnostic framework proved essential. Nietzsche identified how Enlightenment rationalism had undermined its own theological foundations, leaving humans in cosmos that offered no inherent purpose, no cosmic validation, no significance beyond what consciousness temporarily generated. Lovecraft absorbed this recognition while rejecting Nietzsche's heroic response. Where Nietzsche proposed creating meaning through will, Lovecraft's horror explored what happened when even that consolation dissolved. When human meaning-making itself appeared as provincial delusion, and cosmic truth revealed consciousness as temporary statistical fluctuation in entropic void. The astronomical literature of the late 19th century provided empirical foundation for cosmic insignificance. Camille Flammarion's Astronomie populaire, 1880, and Richard Proctor's Other Worlds Than Ours, 1870, popularized the scale of cosmic distances, the plurality of worlds, the likelihood that human existence represented unremarkable occurrence in universe teeming with alien life. These works, which Lovecraft read obsessively in his youth, transformed abstract philosophy into concrete recognition. Earth occupied no privileged position. The sun was ordinary star in ordinary galaxy. Human history, civilizations, wars, artistic achievements, occurred in temporal blink on insignificant planet. This wasn't metaphorical humbling. This was mathematical reality, and it suggested that any entities operating at cosmic scale would relate to humanity the way humans relate to mayflies, brief phenomena unworthy of sustained attention. Yet Lovecraft also inverted the occult cosmologies that dominated fringe intellectual culture in the 1890s to 1920s. Theosophy, particularly Helena Blavatsky's The Secret Doctrine, 1888, proposed elaborate hierarchies of cosmic beings, Mahatmas, ascended masters, entities guiding human evolution toward spiritual perfection. These frameworks assumed universe organized around consciousness development, cosmic teachers invested in human progress, higher dimensions populated by benevolent intelligences. Lovecraft systematically perverted these structures. His cosmic entities existed in higher dimensions, yes, but those dimensions operated under logic that made human consciousness irrelevant accident, not precious development project. Where theosophy offered cosmic meaning, Lovecraft's mythology offered cosmic indifference, structured to suggest that meaning itself represented cognitive error. Lord Dunsany's dreamland fiction provided immediate literary precedent, particularly The Gods of Pagana, 1905, and Time and the Gods, 1906. Dunsany's deities existed beyond human comprehension, indifferent to worship or prayer, creating and destroying worlds through whim or accident. But Dunsany's gods still performed actions, held courts, engaged in recognizably divine behaviors. Lovecraft's innovation was stripping away even this residual anthropomorphism. The most disturbing presence in his mythology didn't act. It didn't create through intention or destroy through malice. It simply was. And it's being operated under principles that made concepts like action and intention appear as local phenomena with no cosmic validity. Robert W. Chambers's The King in Yellow, 1895, introduced contagious knowledge, the the play that drove readers mad through exposure to truths incompatible with sanity. This provided essential template, forbidden knowledge that destroys not through supernatural curse, but through accurate perception of reality's true nature. Lovecraft expanded this principle beyond single text to entire cosmos. The most disturbing entity represented not something forbidden to know, but something that revealed knowledge itself as provincial activity, consciousness as temporary structure imposing false order on chaos that neither required nor acknowledged that order. Arthur Macon's The White People, 1904, and The Great God Pan, 1890, explored non-human intelligences operating according to alien logic, beings that preceded humanity and would survive its extinction. Machen framed these as supernatural or fairy beings, retaining elements of Christian demonology. Lovecraft secularized and expanded the framework. His entities weren't supernatural violations of natural law. They were natural, but natural at scales, and under conditions that made human natural law appear as localized approximation, useful for navigating immediate environment, but catastrophically inadequate for understanding cosmos at large. The scientific materialism of Thomas Huxley and Ernst Haeckel provided final component. Their work demonstrated consciousness emerging from material processes, thoughts reducible to neurochemical events, human identity as temporary pattern in matter governed by physics. This eliminated soul, afterlife, cosmic purpose, but also suggested something more disturbing. If consciousness emerged from material complexity, and material complexity occurred throughout cosmos under varying conditions, then alien consciousnesses would emerge with structures bearing no necessary relationship to human cognition. Not different thoughts, but different categories of thought. Not alternative perspectives, but incommensurable frameworks where perspective ceased to apply. The most disturbing entity would be the one that embodied this recognition. Consciousness itself as local phenomenon, and human consciousness as particularly provincial variant, with no claim to universal validity. These antecedents converged in Lovecraft's recognition that the most disturbing cosmic presence couldn't be an entity you encountered. It had to be the condition you'd always existed within, and the horror emerged from recognizing that condition's true nature, not through supernatural revelation, but through epistemological collapse when local meaning structures confronted cosmic indifference. The naming of cosmic entities in Lovecraft's mythology enacts the epistemological crisis they represent. Azathoth combines harsh consonants and unfamiliar phonetic patterns, but more importantly, it resists stable reference. Unlike Cthulhu, which Lovecraft provided pronunciation guidance for, Cthulhu, Azathoth exists in textual silence. Readers encounter the name without phonetic anchor, without etymological root, without cultural association that would domesticate its otherness. This isn't arbitrary exoticism. This is strategic linguistic alienation, designed to signal that the entity exists outside frameworks where naming constitutes knowledge or control. Lovecraft's correspondence from 1927 reveals deliberate linguistic philosophy. He criticized fantasy writers who used recognizable mythological names, Zeus, Thor, Lucifer, because those names carried cultural baggage that anthropomorphized cosmic forces. His neologisms served specific function to create semantic void around entities that resisted human conceptual frameworks. Azathoth means nothing. It refers without describing, points without illuminating, names without explaining. The word performs the epistemological crisis the entity embodies. language failing at its fundamental task of making the world comprehensible. Consider the architectural and geometric terminology that saturates Lovecraft's descriptions of cosmic entities and spaces. Non-Euclidean geometry appears repeatedly, not as mathematical precision, but as conceptual placeholder for spaces that violate human spatial intuition. Lovecraft absorbed popular accounts of Einstein's relativity and Minkowski's four-dimensional space-time, recognizing that physics had already demonstrated the inadequacy of human perceptual categories. Non-Euclidean spaces weren't supernatural. They were natural under conditions humans never evolved to navigate. This terminology signals something crucial. The most disturbing entity doesn't violate natural law. It operates under natural law at scales where human natural law appears as local approximation, and the entity itself exists in spaces where space stops meaning what human neurology assumes it means. The language of negation pervades descriptions of the ultimate cosmic presence. Formless, shapeless, mindless. These terms don't describe attributes but mark the failure of descriptive categories. When Lovecraft calls Azathoth the blind idiot god, each word undercuts conventional theological language. Gods possess intelligence, intention, creative purpose. Blind negates providential oversight. Idiot negates divine wisdom. Yet God remains, suggesting something that occupies cosmic position where God should be, but emptied of every quality that makes godhood meaningful. This isn't atheism denying divine existence. This is something more disturbing, the recognition that the cosmic position God refers to is occupied by principle that makes divinity itself appear as anthropomorphic projection. Color terminology extends this linguistic crisis. The Color Out of Space, 1927, introduces color beyond visible spectrum, not ultraviolet or infrared, which physics explains, but color as category that includes shades human visual systems cannot process. This seemingly minor detail carries philosophical weight. If color can exist beyond human perception, then entire categories of reality might exist beyond human cognition. The entity that disturbs most deeply would be the one that exists in ontological colors, being categories that human consciousness lacks the cognitive architecture to process, entities that are neither physical nor spiritual, because those categories themselves represent provincial distinctions with no cosmic validity. Lovecraft's invented texts, the Necronomicon, the Panacotic manuscripts, the Aurelian text, function as linguistic artifacts that gesture toward knowledge humans cannot possess. The Necronomicon supposedly contains true names and histories of cosmic entities, but the fragments Lovecraft provides always fail at crucial moments. Descriptions trail off into inadequacy. Crucial passages remain untranslated. The most important revelations drive readers mad before they can articulate what they've learned. This isn't narrative convenience. This is systematic demonstration that language developed for human social coordination and environmental navigation cannot scale to cosmic truth. The words exist, but they cannot mean in ways that preserve sanity or comprehension. The most disturbing entity appears in Lovecraft's work under multiple names, each marking different epistemological failure. Demon Sultan suggests ruling principle. Nuclear chaos suggests fundamental ontological position. The blind idiot God suggests occupied divine position with divine attributes removed. These names don't contradict each other because they're not naming same entity from different perspectives. They're marking the failure of perspective itself. Human language assumes stable reference, entities that persist through time with consistent properties. The cosmic presence at mythology's center exists below the threshold where those assumptions apply. It isn't that we lack the right name. It's that naming assumes cognitive relationship to reality that dissolves in its proximity. This linguistic crisis extends to the entity's supposed court, or retinue, the phrase fluting and beating of drums that attends Azathoth. These aren't descriptions of actual sounds. They're placeholders for something that registers in human consciousness as rhythm and tone, but isn't sound in any physical sense. The language gestures toward sensory experience, while simultaneously marking that experience as categorically different from what terms like flute or drum normally indicate. We recognize the inadequacy of the description in the moment of reading it, and that recognition, the feeling of language failing, constitutes part of the horror. Lovecraft understood that the most disturbing cosmic entity couldn't be described adequately because adequate description assumes commensurability between describer and described. The entity that exists as cosmic substrate, as principle rather than being, as condition rather than creature, requires language that performs its own failure. Every name marks epistemological void. Every description demonstrates description's inadequacy. And in that linguistic collapse, readers experience in miniature what characters experience in full. The recognition that human meaning-making tools fail when confronted with cosmos structured on principles, those tools were never designed to navigate. Lovecraft's methodology for constructing cosmic mythology departed from traditional fantasy world-building through systematic embrace of fragmentation and uncertainty. Beginning with The Call of Cthulhu in 1926, he embedded his invented entities within framework that mimicked legitimate scholarly research, archaeological reports, academic journals, police investigations, manuscript discoveries, precisely to make the mythology feel like history obscured rather than fiction invented. This wasn't simple verisimilitude. This was recognition that the most disturbing cosmic truth would feel like something rediscovered rather than imagined, something that had always existed in reality's margins, waiting for pattern recognition to assemble disparate evidence into terrible coherence. The Necronomicon serves as central mechanism for this authentication strategy. Lovecraft first mentioned Abdul al-Hazred's forbidden text in The Hound, 1922, providing specific bibliographic details. Written in Damascus in 730 AD, translated to Greek by Theodorus Philetas in 950, Latin edition by Olaus Wormius in 1228, original Arabic text lost. These details create historical density without historical verification, precise enough to feel researched, obscure enough to resist disproof. More importantly, the Necronomicon appears across multiple stories in different contexts, sometimes providing crucial information, sometimes merely referenced in passing, creating illusion of persistent object existing independent of any single narrative. Readers encounter the text the way scholars encounter historical artifacts. Through fragmentary evidence, contradictory accounts, tantalizing glimpses that suggest larger, coherent whole forever beyond complete reconstruction. Cross-referencing between stories intensified this authentication effect. When The Dunwich Horror, 1928, mentions the Pnakotic manuscripts previously referenced in The Other Gods, 1921, or when At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, alludes to the Ar-Laye text from The Call of Cthulhu. The mythology acquires depth that transcends individual narratives. This technique mirrors how actual mythologies develop through accumulated tradition, variant tellings, references that assume prior knowledge. But Lovecraft's innovation was applying this to entities specifically designed to resist coherent understanding. The cross-references never fully align. Details contradict. Chronologies clash. This inconsistency doesn't undermine the mythology. It strengthens it, because the most disturbing cosmic truth would naturally resist coherent narrative, existing instead as traumatic intrusion that each witness processes through inadequate cognitive frameworks. The use of unreliable narrators extends this epistemological uncertainty. Lovecraft's stories rarely feature omniscient third-person narration. Instead, they're presented as manuscripts found after the narrator's death, testimonies given under psychological duress, academic papers that inadvertently reveal more than the author comprehends. In The Shadow Out of Time, 1934-35, the narrator Nathaniel Peaslee cannot trust his own memories, suspecting his consciousness was displaced by alien intelligence from Earth's deep past. This narrative structure performs the philosophical crisis the entity represents. If human consciousness can be invaded, displaced, or manipulated by cosmic forces, then the narration itself becomes suspect. We're reading testimony that might be contaminated by the very entity it describes, creating infinite regress where verification becomes impossible. Lovecraft deliberately avoided definitive explanations or systematic theology. Where later writers like August Derleth imposed coherent structure, categorizing entities as elemental forces, establishing clear hierarchies, defining good and evil alignments, Lovecraft's original texts maintained productive ambiguity. Is Azathoth conscious or mindless? Both terms appear in different stories. Does it rule the cosmos or merely exist at its center? The texts support either reading. This ambiguity wasn't artistic failure. It was philosophical necessity. The entity that disturbs most profoundly must resist reduction to systematic knowledge, because systematic knowledge assumes cosmos organized in ways human cognition can map. The contradictions in the mythology signal that human conceptual frameworks themselves become unstable when applied to cosmic principles that predate and supersede human categories. The found manuscript device appears throughout Lovecraft's major works, creating multiple layers of textual mediation. We don't encounter cosmic truth directly. We encounter someone's written account of encountering cosmic truth, usually found after their disappearance, death, or institutionalization. This framing acknowledges that direct encounter with the most disturbing entity cannot be narrated because narration requires stable consciousness, sequential time, coherent causality. The manuscript exists as artifact, evidence that encounter occurred, but proof that encounter resisted successful communication. The gaps, the nervous breakdowns mid-sentence, the passages trailing into incoherence. These aren't artistic flourishes, but necessary features of attempting to narrate the unnarratable. Lovecraft's correspondence reveals awareness that his most disturbing creation couldn't be the explicit subject of narrative. In a 1927 letter to Clark Ashton Smith, he wrote that the most potent cosmic horror would be the recognition that gods and demons are equally irrelevant to the actual structure of reality. This suggests that Azathoth or Yog-Sothoth weren't themselves the ultimate horror. They were placeholders, names assigned to recognition that ultimate reality operated according to principles that made names, categories, and ontological distinctions themselves appear as local cognitive phenomena. The entity that disturbs most exists where narrative fails, where even the invented mythology acknowledges its own inadequacy. This myth-building strategy creates peculiar reading experience. Readers absorb mythology through accumulation rather than exposition, encountering entities obliquely across multiple stories, assembling fragmentary picture that never resolves into clear image. This parallels how the entity itself supposedly exists, not as coherent being, but as principle glimpsed through gaps in reality, recognized through pattern that emerges from accumulated evidence rather than direct perception. The mythology's fragmentation isn't obstacle to understanding. It's the closest representation possible of what understanding this entity would feel like. Partial, uncertain, structured by recognition that every attempt at systematic knowledge produces new gaps and contradictions. The authenticity Lovecraft achieved came not from detailed world building, but from systematic acknowledgement that certain cosmic truths resist coherent representation. The most disturbing entity in his mythology succeeds precisely because it exists in the mythology's silences, in the contradictions between accounts, in the space where narrative coherence breaks down, and readers recognize that breakdown is more truthful than any systematic explanation could be. We're not reading about the entity, we're experiencing, in miniature and safely, what encountering its actual cosmic position would do to consciousness structured around narrative coherence, causal logic, and stable ontological categories. Human insignificance in Lovecraft's cosmos operates not as moral judgment, but as mathematical fact. The scale problem emerges immediately. Human civilization spans perhaps 10,000 years. Cosmic time measures in billions. Earth's diameter is roughly 12,700 kilometers. The observable universe extends 93 billion light years. These aren't metaphorical comparisons. They're ratios that render human history equivalent to single frame in film-spanning geological epochs. Human concerns equivalent to electrons' perspective on continental drift. The most disturbing entity embodies this scale. Disparity not as cruel giant observing insects, but as principle operating at temporal and spatial dimensions where human existence fails to register as phenomenon worth distinguishing from background noise. This connects to entropy's inexorable logic, the second law of thermodynamics guaranteeing universal heat death. Energy disperses, complexity dissolves, organized structures decay into thermal equilibrium. Life represents temporary local decrease in entropy, paid for by larger increases elsewhere, ultimately futile resistance to equilibrium state. The entity at cosmic center in Lovecraft's mythology embodies this entropic principle, not fighting against order, but existing as blind mechanism that generates and dissolves complexity without distinction, without preference, churning through configurations where conscious life occasionally emerges as statistical accident. Azathoth's traditional description as nuclear chaos suggests not supernatural force, but thermodynamic reality. The cosmos operates through processes that generate temporary order and inevitable dissolution with equal indifference. Yet the dream framework complicates even this mechanistic horror. If reality exists as dream of blind idiot God, a recurring suggestion across The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1926-27, The Silver Key, 1926, and fragments of Lovecraft's later correspondence, then human insignificance becomes something stranger than mere scale disparity. We're not just small within vast cosmos. We're potentially unreal within dreamed cosmos, patterns in sleeping mind that itself lacks coherent consciousness. This doesn't console through fantasy. It horrifies through epistemological vertigo. If cosmos is dream, physical laws become contingent. Reality becomes provisional. and the possibility emerges that the dreaming principle might shift attention or cease dreaming entirely, collapsing reality not through catastrophe, but through withdrawal of whatever sustaining principle maintains appearance of consistent physical law. The most disturbing implication concerns consciousness itself. Human thought assumes consciousness emerged through evolution, neural complexity producing subjective experience as emergent property. But if cosmos itself possesses dream logic, if the fundamental substrate operates through something analogous to dreaming, then human consciousness might be fragment or reflection of cosmic consciousness. Brief local eddy in larger currents that flow according to principles bearing no necessary relationship to reason, causality, or coherent identity. We experience thought as linear, logical, purposive, but that experience might represent provincial interpretation of processes that, viewed from cosmic perspective, appear as chaotic as dream imagery, meaningful to dreamer in moment, dissolving into incoherence upon examination. This connects to Lovecraft's materialist conviction that consciousness reduces to physical processes, that thoughts are neurochemical events in brains that are cellular structures, that are molecular arrangements, that are quantum processes. At every level of analysis, what feels like unified self fragments into impersonal mechanisms. The entity that disturbs most profoundly would be the one that makes this reductionism cosmically literal. Not consciousness emerging from matter, but consciousness and matter, both emerging as local phenomena within substrate that transcends and encompasses both categories, existing below the threshold where distinctions between mental and physical apply. Time emerges as another category that collapses in proximity to cosmic principle. Human experience structures reality around past, present, future, causality flowing forward, memory preserving history. But physics suggests time might be symmetrical at fundamental level, the arrow of time emerging from entropy rather than built into cosmic structure. If the most disturbing entity exists outside or prior to time as dimension, if it occupies position where temporal sequence doesn't apply, then cause and effect become local phenomena, memory becomes unreliable guide, and the possibility emerges that entity influences past and future simultaneously, weaving through timeline in ways that make human historical consciousness appear as limited as earthworms' perception of three-dimensional space. Scale, entropy, dream logic, temporal disorientation, these philosophical concepts converge on recognition that disturbs because it offers no resolution. Traditional horror allows hope. Defeat the monster, close the portal, break the curse. Cosmic horror, structured around entity as principle, offers no such consolation. You cannot defeat entropy. You cannot escape scale disparity. You cannot wake from dream if you exist as content of that dream. The entity doesn't threaten to destroy reality. It reveals reality as always already structured by principles that make human meaning, making appear as temporary, local phenomenon, consciousness as cosmic accident, and all human frameworks for understanding existence as inadequate approximations useful for immediate survival, but catastrophically insufficient for genuine cosmic comprehension. The horror deepens with recognition that this isn't pessimistic philosophy imposed on neutral cosmos. This is accurate description of cosmos as contemporary physics reveals it. Vast, old, governed by impersonal laws, ultimately trending toward heat death, generating consciousness as side effect of processes that neither require nor privilege awareness. Lovecraft's entity simply makes explicit what scientific materialism implies. We exist in universe structured in ways that make our existence meaningless. And that meaninglessness isn't tragedy requiring consolation, but simple fact requiring acknowledgement. The taxonomy of cosmic entities in Lovecraft's mythology establishes hierarchy of disturbing presence, with crucial distinction between great old ones and outer gods marking difference between powerful aliens and fundamental principles. Cthulhu, for instance, represents great old one, ancient, powerful, alien, but ultimately physical being that occupied Earth in deep past and will presumably return. Cthulhu disturbs through alien morphology, psychic influence, temporal persistence across epochs. But Cthulhu can be described, located in Aurelier's sunken geometry, understood as entity that exists within cosmos, even if radically different from humanity. The outer gods operate on different ontological register entirely. Azathoth occupies cosmic center in most accounts, described variously as demon sultan, blind idiot god, nuclear chaos at the center of infinity. These descriptions contradict. Sultans rule with intention, idiots lack agency, chaos resists organization. The contradiction signals what Azathoth represents, not being but principle that exists where human conceptual categories break down. If Azathoth possesses consciousness, that consciousness operates at scale and under logic that makes human consciousness appear as brief localized phenomenon, thought as provincial activity. If Azathoth lacks consciousness, then the cosmic center, the position where God should rule with wisdom and purpose, is occupied instead by blind mechanism, and the universe operates without oversight, intention, or meaning at its deepest level. The court of Azathoth extends this horror through sensory imagery that resists coherent interpretation. According to The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, flute-playing entities surround the demon sultan, their music somehow sustaining or accompanying cosmic chaos. But these aren't musicians in any conventional sense. They're processes or forces that register in human perception as rhythm and melody, phenomena that occupy same relationship to actual music that human consciousness occupies to whatever cosmic process is generated. The image of flutes and drums playing for mindless gods suggests cruel mockery, beauty and order serving meaningless chaos, but also suggests something more disturbing, that what humans experience as meaningful pattern might be artifact of limited perception, and cosmic reality operates below the threshold where meaning emerges. Yog-Sothoth represents alternative formulation of cosmic disturbance, described in The Dunwich Horror, 1928, as the gate and the key existing coterminously with all space and time. Where Azathoth suggests blind mechanism at cosmic center, Yog-Sothoth suggests omniscience without benevolence, awareness of everything that has occurred is occurring and will occur across all dimensions and timelines, but awareness divorced from care, purpose, or intervention. Yog-Sothoth knows but doesn't act to prevent suffering, doesn't guide toward improvement, doesn't acknowledge human consciousness as more significant than any other temporary configuration of matter. This omniscient indifference disturbs, more than ignorance or malice, precisely because it suggests cosmic awareness that has access to complete truth and finds nothing in that truth requiring mercy or meaning. Nyarlathotep introduces active malice into equation, but malice of peculiar type. Unlike traditional demons who tempt toward damnation or devils who punish sin, Nyarlathotep serves as messenger or soul and herald of Azathoth, bringing awareness of cosmic truth to humans whose consciousness cannot survive that awareness intact. The disturbing implication, Accurate cosmic knowledge functions as weapon, and Nyarlathotep's cruelty consists not in lying, but in revealing truth to beings whose sanity depends on ignorance. When Nyarlathotep appears in Nyarlathotep, 1920, or The Haunter of the Dark, 1935, his presence correlates with epistemological collapse. Witnesses experience not supernatural possession, but recognition that overwhelms cognitive frameworks built around meaning, purpose, identity. Shub-Niggurath, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, represents fertility horror, life itself as cosmic plague, reproduction as mindless propagation without purpose or improvement. Where traditional fertility deities bless humans with offspring and abundant harvest, Shub-Niggurath suggests procreation as meaningless multiplication, consciousness reproducing itself in generation after generation without progress toward any goal. Life continuing because molecular processes favor replication rather than because existence serves purpose. This inverts the consolation that children give meaning to individual mortality. Under Shub-Niggurath's principle, reproduction simply extends meaninglessness across time, each generation another iteration of cosmic accident, mistaking itself for significance. The distinction between these entities and forces matters less than what they collectively represent. A cosmos structured on principles that predate and supersede human categories of meaning. They're not gods in theological sense. They don't answer prayers, punish wickedness, reward virtue. They're not aliens in science fiction sense. They don't want resources, territory, communication. They exist as principles or processes that operate at scales where human existence fails to register as phenomenon requiring acknowledgement. Azathoth as blind mechanism, Yog-Sothoth as indifferent omniscience, Nyarlathotep as truth that destroys, Shub-Niggurath as meaningless fertility. Each formulates cosmic horror differently, but all converge on recognition that disturbs through accuracy rather than fantasy. The most disturbing entity among these forces would be the one that makes even existence seem like provincial category. Not something that threatens human existence from outside, but something that reveals existence itself as temporary phenomenon, consciousness as local fluctuation, and all human frameworks for understanding reality as approximations that work at immediate scales, but catastrophically fail when extended to cosmic scope. We cannot defeat this entity because it isn't opposed to us. It's the medium we exist within, and recognition of that medium's true nature constitutes the horror itself. Madness in Lovecraft's mythology operates not as mental illness requiring treatment, but as accurate perception requiring cognitive frameworks human neurology cannot provide. When protagonists in The Call of Cthulhu encounter cosmic truth, their descent into incoherence doesn't represent psychological disorder, but epistemological collapse. The mind breaking not because it's defective, but because it's confronting reality structured in ways human cognition never evolved to process. Traditional madness represents malfunction of perceptual apparatus. Lovecraftian madness represents correct function of perceptual apparatus encountering stimuli. It lacks categories to organize, like colorblind person suddenly perceiving full spectrum or three-dimensional being thrust into four-dimensional space. This reframes sanity as useful delusion rather than accurate perception. Human consciousness evolved to navigate immediate social and environmental challenges, recognize faces, track causality, maintain narrative self-identity, coordinate with tribal group. These cognitive tools work brilliantly at human scale for human purposes, but they're optimized for survival rather than truth, and they impose structure on reality that exists in perception rather than cosmos itself. Sanity consists of maintaining these useful fictions, that self is unified entity, that time flows linearly, that causality operates consistently, that human life possesses inherent meaning. Madness emerges when cosmic truth penetrates these protective frameworks, revealing them as provincial approximations rather than universal truths. The cults that worship outer gods represent rational response to cosmic recognition rather than delusional pathology. In the Call of Cthulhu, the Louisiana cult conducts rituals honoring entities that will eventually reclaim Earth, human civilization appearing as brief interruption in cosmic cycles that preceded humanity by aeons and will continue after extinction. From conventional perspective, these cultists are insane, abandoning human values to serve inhuman forces. From cosmic perspective, they've achieved accurate assessment of humanity's position and adjusted behavior accordingly. Their rituals don't matter in sense of influencing cosmic forces, but neither does anything humans do matter at that scale. The cultists simply acknowledge this openly, while others maintain comforting delusion of significance. Physical transformation accompanies exposure to cosmic entities, suggesting that contact operates not through supernatural curse, but through something closer to radiation exposure or mimetic contamination. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1931, the Deep One hybrids gradually transform from human to aquatic form, their biology rewriting itself in proximity to alien genetic patterns. This isn't mutation in sense of random error. It's reorganization according to alternative biological template, body recognizing and adopting form more suited to cosmic reality than human morphology. The horror lies not in monstrousness, but in suggestion that human form itself represents temporary configuration, and exposure to cosmic truth triggers reversion or progression toward forms that exist in closer alignment with universe's actual structure. Dreams function as invasion vector, precisely because sleep represents state, where ego boundaries weaken and consciousness becomes permeable to influences normally filtered by waking cognition. In The Dreams in the Witch House, 1932, protagonist Walter Gilman experiences mathematical insights during sleep that allow navigation through higher dimensional space. But these insights arrive paired with encounters with entities existing in those dimensions. The mathematical truth and cosmic horror prove inseparable. Accurate understanding of space's actual geometry necessarily involves recognition of what occupies that space, and what occupies it operates according to logic incompatible with human survival or sanity. Dreams aren't supernatural visions, but cognitive states where protective frameworks dissolve and consciousness touches reality more directly. The impossibility of integration represents deepest horror. Knowledge that cannot be unknown, truth that cannot be incorporated into functional worldview, recognition that persists while destroying capacity to function. Protagonist Nathaniel Darby Pickman, in The Shadow Out of Time, recovers memories of his consciousness being displaced by alien intelligence, gaining access to vast archives of Earth's deep past and cosmic future. But this knowledge arrives without framework for processing it. He knows without being able to act on knowledge, understands without being able to communicate understanding to others who haven't undergone same cognitive rupture. The truth isolates because it's incommunicable to those whose sanity depends on ignorance, creating unbridgeable gap between those who know and those who don't. Suicide and self-destruction emerge as logical responses rather than tragic failures. If cosmic truth reveals human life as meaningless accident in indifferent universe, And if knowing this truth makes continued existence psychologically unbearable, then choosing non-existence represents rational decision rather than mental illness. Multiple Lovecraft stories end with protagonists dying, whether through direct action or through surrender to forces they've encountered. This isn't defeat in conventional narrative sense. It's recognition that living with cosmic truth intact requires either madness, accurate perception with destroyed functionality, or death, escape from consciousness that has become burden rather than gift. The entity that disturbs most profoundly would be the one that makes continued conscious existence seem like punishment rather than privilege. Human interaction with cosmic forces thus reveals consciousness itself as vulnerable rather than valuable. We assume awareness represents evolutionary achievement, cognitive complexity representing progress. But in proximity to entities operating as cosmic principles, consciousness appears as liability, the thing that suffers when confronting truth it cannot process, the mechanism that breaks when exposed to realities beyond its operational parameters. Rocks don't go mad when Azathoth's nature becomes clear. Bacteria don't experience existential horror when recognizing cosmic insignificance. Only consciousness sophisticated enough to grasp its own meaninglessness suffers from that recognition. The most disturbing entity makes cognitive sophistication itself seem like cosmic cruelty, evolution producing awareness just sufficient to recognize its own futility, but insufficient to bear that recognition without collapse. Knowledge in Lovecraft's framework operates as contamination rather than accumulation, each insight into cosmic truth degrading capacity for continued function within human, social, and psychological frameworks. The Necronomicon embodies this principle most clearly. Grimoire containing formulae, histories, and cosmological revelations that drive readers mad, not through supernatural curse, but through accurate information that human cognition cannot successfully integrate. This inverts Enlightenment assumption that knowledge liberates and ignorance imprisons. Cosmic truth binds through revelation, while protective ignorance allows continued existence within meaning structures necessary for psychological survival. Mathematics and geometry provide particularly dangerous vectors for forbidden knowledge because they claim universal validity independent of human perspective. In The Dreams in the Witch House, Walter Gilman's research into non-Euclidean calculus and dimensional topology reveals that physical space possesses properties and connections undetectable through normal perception. These aren't mystical secrets, they're geometric facts, mathematical truths that happen to indicate space is structured in ways that allow entity passage between dimensions. Ritual efficacy through proper spatial configurations, and human consciousness to navigate hyperspace given correct formulae. The horror emerges from recognition that rigorous mathematical inquiry leads directly to cosmic truths incompatible with continued sanity, suggesting reason itself becomes dangerous when pursued beyond human-scale applications. The problem of communicating the incomprehensible appears repeatedly as narrative crisis. Characters who encounter cosmic entities struggle to describe what they've witnessed, their language failing to capture experiences that transcend categories like saw, or heard, or even experienced. In The Color Out of Space, the narrator attempts to describe color beyond visible spectrum, repeatedly acknowledging descriptive failure while conveying enough information that readers recognize something real was encountered, despite inadequacy of available terminology. This creates peculiar epistemic trap. The witness knows they encountered truth, but cannot communicate that truth to others, creating isolation between those who know and those who don't. with no reliable method for transferring knowledge across that boundary. Archives, libraries, and universities become sites of contamination in this framework, inverting conventional association between scholarship and safety. Miskatonic University's library in Arkham contains restricted collection of occult texts that function as memetic hazards, books that infect readers with knowledge incompatible with continued well-being. The academic framing increases rather than decreases danger, because scholarly authority lends credibility to texts that would be dismissed as ravings if encountered without institutional validation. Professors and researchers who pursue cosmic questions too rigorously become casualties, their expertise and curiosity transforming from virtues into vulnerabilities that draw them toward truths human cognition cannot successfully process. Scientific inquiry thus leads to horror rather than enlightenment when pursued beyond limits of human-relevant questions. Research into Earth's deep past in At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, reveals ancient civilizations and alien ecologies that predate humanity by hundreds of millions of years, demonstrating that human existence represents recent and potentially temporary phenomenon in planet's history. Astronomical investigations reveal cosmic distances and timescales that render human concerns insignificant. Biological research reveals consciousness as emergent property of matter rather than divine gift. Each scientific advance, pursued honestly, erodes anthropocentric frameworks that provide psychological comfort, replacing consoling myths with accurate assessments of humanity's cosmic position. The Necronomicon functions as epistemological weapon precisely because it concentrates this dangerous knowledge into accessible format. Rather than requiring original research across multiple disciplines, the text provides direct access to cosmic truths that would otherwise require careers of specialized study to approach. Abdul al-Hazred's mad Arab persona suggests the text's author achieved cosmic knowledge at cost of sanity, then transcribed revelations while consciousness remained functional enough to write. The book thus exists as artifact of successful cosmic encounter, evidence that knowledge can be gained and recorded, but also as warning that gaining and recording such knowledge doesn't preserve functionality or well-being of the one who knows. Knowledge as virus emerges as recurring metaphor with literal force. Ideas that cannot be unlearned spread between minds like contagion, each person who learns cosmic truth, becoming potential vector for transmitting that truth to others. The futility of warning appears throughout Lovecraft's work. Characters who survive cosmic encounters attempt to warn others, but their warnings either aren't believed, dismissed as ravings, or succeed in communicating enough information to contaminate listeners with same knowledge that destroyed the warner's sanity. This creates no win scenario. Silence allows others to stumble into same dangerous knowledge independently, while speaking spreads the contamination more efficiently than it prevents harm. The deepest epistemic horror concerns self-reference, the recognition that consciousness investigating reality exists as temporary phenomenon within that reality, and that complete understanding would necessarily include understanding consciousness's own contingency and meaninglessness. Descartes proposed cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, as foundation for certain knowledge. Lovecraftian epistemology suggests, I think therefore I am temporary, contingent, and cosmically insignificant. Consciousness becomes aware of its own status as cosmic accident, creating reflexive crisis where the thing attempting to understand reveals its own inadequacy through that very attempt. The most disturbing entity would be the one that makes this self-referential collapse inevitable. where any attempt to understand cosmic structure necessarily includes recognition of consciousness's peripheral status within that structure, and that recognition undermines the cognitive frameworks required to continue functioning. This transforms pursuit of knowledge from noble enterprise into existential risk. Every question answered accurately moves investigator closer to truths incompatible with continued well-being. Every mystery solved reveals larger mysteries structured to resist human comprehension. The universe isn't hiding its secrets to protect humanity. It simply operates according to principles that become dangerous when partially understood through cognitive frameworks designed for different purposes. The entity that exists as cosmic principle disturbs most profoundly because it reveals knowledge itself as trap. Ignorance allows continued function within comfortable delusions, while knowledge destroys those delusions without providing alternative frameworks capable of bearing cosmic truth without psychological collapse. Azathoth's first textual appearance occurs in the fragment simply titled Azathoth, written in 1922, but left incomplete after a single paragraph. Lovecraft describes a man ascending through strata of dreams until reaching ultimate void, where the ancient legends of ultimate chaos, at whose center sprawls the blind idiot god, Azathoth, lord of all things, encircled by his flopping horde of mindless and amorphous dancers, and lulled by the thin monotonous piping of a demonic flute held in nameless paws. This passage establishes core imagery, cosmic center occupied by mindless principle, attended by entities reduced to pure function, sustained or accompanied by rhythm that parodies meaning. The fragment's incompletion mirrors its subject, the entity that exists where narrative coherence breaks down, resists narrative completion. The 1926 prose poem, Nyarlathotep, introduces the messenger figure who serves as intermediary between human consciousness and cosmic truth, though the text predates explicit Azathoth mythology. Nyarlathotep arrives in modern world, bringing demonstrations that blend advanced technology with revelations of cosmic horror, his lectures causing audiences to flee, shrieking into the night. The connection to Azathoth emerges later in The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath, 1926-27, where Nyarlathotep serves as soul and messenger of the demon sultan. This relationship suggests that the most disturbing entity requires herald, because direct encounter cannot be narrated. Consciousness collapses before description becomes possible, necessitating intermediary who translates cosmic principle into forms that penetrate human awareness without immediate annihilation. The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, establishes the interconnected mythology most explicitly, though Azathoth appears only in passing reference. The story's famous opening, "The most merciful thing in the world, I think, is the inability of the human mind to correlate all its contents," articulates the epistemological horror that Azathoth embodies at cosmic scale. Cthulhu himself represents localized, comprehensible threat, ancient alien entity sleeping in sunken city, influencing human dreams, awaiting return when stars are right. But the story's structure, fragmentary accounts assembled by narrator from uncle's research, police reports, artist's testimony, sailor's manuscript, enacts the fragmentation that cosmic truth imposes on human understanding. Each witness glimpses different aspect of larger pattern, and assembling complete picture drives the narrator toward recognition he can barely articulate. The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath provides most extended engagement with Azathoth and the cosmic court, though characteristically the entity appears as destination never reached, rather than presence directly encountered. Protagonist Randolph Carter seeks the gods of Earth's dreamlands, his quest leading him toward Kadath, where gods supposedly dwell. But Kadath proves to be throne of Nyarlathotep, who reveals that Earth's gods have been displaced, forced to worship at Azathoth's court in the central void. Carter glimpses this court through vision rather than physical presence. Shapeless bat things of that realm whereof rumor whispers its fearful name, and the muffled, maddening beat of vile drums, and the thin, monotonous whine of blasphemous flutes. The scene structures horror around absence. Carter is shown but not brought, recognizes but cannot describe, understands that ultimate cosmic reality exists beyond threshold where his consciousness could survive. The interconnections between stories create mythology through accumulation rather than exposition. The Dunwich Horror, 1928, mentions Yog-Sothoth as entity coterminous with space and time, existing simultaneously at all points and moments. The Whisperer in Darkness, 1930, reveals alien race mining Earth for metals, their activities contextualizing human civilization as background to larger cosmic processes. At the Mountains of Madness, 1931, pushes human insignificance to geological timescales, revealing ancient alien civilization that preceded humanity by hundreds of millions of years and was itself created by elder things as slave race. Each story adds evidence of cosmos structured on scales and according to principles that dwarf human concerns, creating accumulated weight of cosmic indifference that makes Azathoth's mindless rule seem like inevitable conclusion rather than fantastic invention. The cross-referencing between Lovecraft's circle writers intensified this authentication effect. Clark Ashton Smith mentioned Azathoth in The Door to Saturn, 1932. Robert E. Howard referenced the Demon Sultan in The Black Stone, 1931. Frank Belknap Long incorporated cosmic hierarchy in The Hounds of Tindalos, 1929. These references created illusion of persistent mythology, existing independent of any single author, readers encountering cosmic entities through multiple witnesses across various contexts. The technique mirrors academic discourse, where authorities cite common sources, building legitimacy through consensus. But in this case, the consensus concerns entities designed to resist understanding, creating paradox where increased evidence generates increased uncertainty about what the evidence actually describes. The evolution across these texts reveals Lovecraft progressively deepening the philosophical implications of cosmic indifference. Early, stories like Dagon, 1917, featured alien entities but maintained conventional narrative structure where protagonist encounters threat and escapes or dies. By the late 1920s, stories like The Color Out of Space, 1927, featured threats that resisted categorization: color beyond spectrum, life form without recognizable biology, intelligence that operated through principles bearing no relationship to human consciousness. Azathoth emerged as ultimate expression of this progression, not alien being with alternative biology and cognition, but cosmic principle that existed where categories like being, biology, and cognition ceased to apply meaningfully. The intertext connections thus built mythology that resisted systematization even as it accumulated detail. Readers learned that Azathoth ruled at cosmic center, that Nyarlathotep served as messenger, that Yog-Sothoth existed coterminously with all space and time, that lesser entities occupied various positions in cosmic hierarchy. But these details never cohered into consistent theology or cosmology. Descriptions contradicted, chronologies clashed. The very attempt to systematize the mythology revealed gaps and inconsistencies that suggested cosmic truth transcended human capacity for systematic knowledge. The most disturbing entity succeeded precisely through this resistance to coherent description, existing in accumulated fragments that individually made partial sense, but collectively resisted integration into stable understanding. Walter Gilman's fatal curiosity begins with mathematical research rather than occult interest, establishing horror's foundation in rigorous inquiry rather than supernatural transgression. A graduate student at Miskatonic University studying non-Euclidean calculus and quantum physics, Gilman rents room in Arkham's infamous witch house because cheap lodging allows him to afford continued studies. The room's peculiar angles, walls meeting at odd degrees, corners that seem geometrically impossible, initially attract him as architectural curiosity, potentially relevant to his dimensional topology research. This inverts traditional horror structure, where protagonists stumble into danger through ignorance or recklessness. Gilman approaches cosmic horror through intellectual rigor, his mathematical sophistication making him vulnerable rather than protected. The room's geometry proves to be intentional configuration rather than construction flaw. Previous tenant Keziah Mason, tried for witchcraft in 1692, supposedly used the space's non-Euclidean properties to navigate between dimensions, appearing and disappearing from locked cells through spatial manipulation rather than supernatural power. Gilman's dreams begin to feature mathematical insights about higher dimensional space, revelations arriving with clarity that suggests external source rather than unconscious processing. He dreams of abysses whose material and gravitational properties, and whose relation to his own entity he could not even begin to explain, experiencing spaces that his waking mathematics can describe formally, but his consciousness cannot successfully visualize or navigate while retaining coherent identity. The entity Brown Jenkin, Keziah's familiar, described as a small white-fanged thing with almost human face and rat-like paws, embodies the horror of consciousness existing outside recognizable categories. Neither animal nor human, Brown Jenkin possesses intelligence that operates through alien logic, apparently surviving across centuries through means Gilman's biology cannot explain. The creature speaks in human voice, its communications suggesting knowledge of mathematical principles governing dimensional transit. This disturbs more than simple monsters because it indicates consciousness has evolved or been created according to principles radically different from terrestrial biology, producing intelligence that shares no common framework with human cognition despite superficial communication ability. Gilman's progressive transformation from scholar to participant occurs through dreams that become increasingly indistinguishable from waking experience. He dreams of flying through space, guided by Keziah and Brown Jenkin, visiting worlds of endless light and color and geometrical shapelessness, spaces where physical laws operate differently and consciousness must restructure perception to avoid dissolution. Upon waking, he finds mud on his feet, suggesting dream travel left physical traces. This erosion of boundary between sleep and waking, between subjective experience and objective reality, enacts the epistemological collapse that Azathoth's cosmic position implies. If consciousness can be displaced through dimensional travel during sleep, then waking identity becomes provisional rather than stable, and the self becomes temporary configuration subject to disruption by cosmic forces. The climactic ritual scene reveals cosmic horror operating through concrete rather than abstract terms. Keziah intends to sacrifice infant to power she serves, ritual requiring specific spatial configuration and temporal alignment, while Purgus Eve when dimensional boundaries weaken. Gilman attempts intervention, struggling to prevent murder while recognizing that his mathematical insights into space's true nature have made him complicit in forces he lacks moral framework to oppose. His knowledge of non-Euclidean geometry allows him to perceive ritual's function. Proper spatial arrangement creates gateway or signal, but doesn't provide basis for evaluating whether that function should be opposed or assisted. Scientific understanding, divorced from ethical framework, leaves him paralyzed between human sympathy for infant and cosmic recognition that human life possesses no inherent significance. The story's conclusion reinforces horror through ambiguity rather than resolution. Gilman apparently prevents sacrifice and kills Brown Jenkin, but dies in the process as something emerges from the walls of his room. The thin, monotonous piping of an unseen flute accompanying his death. The autopsy reveals his heart has been consumed, eaten from within by something that left no entry wound. This suggests Gilman's mathematical insights and dimensional travel exposed him to contamination that killed him from inside. Knowledge itself operating as vector for cosmic forces that don't need to manifest physically to destroy those who perceive them accurately. The entity or principle he encountered through dreams and mathematics consumed him not through supernatural curse, but through consequences of consciousness navigating spaces it evolved no defenses against. The story's power derives from making cosmic horror concrete and personal. Rather than vast entities described in abstract terms, the dreams in the witch house presents specific individual destroyed by specific pursuit of specific knowledge that proved incompatible with continued survival. Gilman's mathematical sophistication, his ability to understand non-Euclidean geometry and quantum physics, transforms from accomplishment into vulnerability. His consciousness develops sufficient complexity to recognize cosmic truth, but insufficient resilience to survive that recognition. The entity that ultimately destroys him remains ambiguous. Brown Jenkin serves as immediate threat, Keziah as human intermediary, Azathoth as distant principal whose court Gilman apparently approached through dimensional navigation. But the hierarchy matters less than recognition that rigorous inquiry into space's actual structure leads directly to horror, suggesting mathematics itself becomes dangerous when pursued beyond human-scale applications. The story thus demonstrates how the most disturbing entity operates through epistemological contamination rather than physical threat. Gilman dies not because monster attacks him, but because accurate understanding of reality structure exposes consciousness to forces it cannot withstand. His mathematical dreams provide genuine insights. His equations work. His calculations prove accurate, but accuracy proves lethal. The thin piping that accompanies his death suggests proximity to Azathoth's court, the blind idiot god's senseless rhythm penetrating into mundane Arkham through gaps in reality that Gilman's research helped him perceive. Knowledge that should empower instead destroys, and the destruction arrives as consequence of being right rather than wrong about cosmic structure. Nathaniel Darby, Pickman's catastrophic experience begins not with occult experimentation, but with spontaneous consciousness displacement while lecturing on political economy at Miskatonic University in 1908. One moment he teaches students. Next moment he collapses as something replaces his consciousness with alien intelligence from Earth's deep past. For 5 years, his body continues functioning, learning ancient languages, accessing restricted library materials, constructing strange machines, while Nathaniel's consciousness experiences life in massive cone-shaped body belonging to great race of Yith, beings who project minds across time to escape their species' eventual extinction. This presents horror's foundation, consciousness as transferable pattern rather than essential self, identity as temporary configuration subject to displacement by forces operating across cosmic timescales. The Great Race embodies disturbing alternative to typical cosmic entities precisely through their scientific sophistication and archival obsession. Rather than mindless forces or malevolent gods, they represent intelligence that achieved mastery over time itself, projecting consciousness forward and backward through history to gather knowledge and evade catastrophe. They maintain vast library containing history of every species that has achieved consciousness on Earth across hundreds of millions of years, documenting civilizations that rose and fell long before humanity's ancestors emerged from oceans. This creates peculiar horror. Entities that value knowledge as humans do, but operate at temporal scales where entire species appear as brief entries in cosmic catalog, individual consciousnesses as data points useful for historical completeness rather than beings worthy of moral consideration. Nathaniel's recovered memories, returning gradually after his consciousness returns to his own body in 1913, reveal what his awareness experienced during displacement. He lived in Great Race City of black basalt towers during Earth's Paleozoic era, body belonging to species that would dominate the planet for millions of years before projecting consciousness forward to escape approaching extinction. His Yithian captors treated him not cruelly, but with scientific detachment, extracting information about 20th century humanity, the way human zoologists might study temporarily captured animal, noting interesting behavioral patterns, recording technological level, filing data away in archives before returning specimen to native time. This inverts conventional abduction horror. Aliens display no hostility, simply radical indifference to individual autonomy or consent when gathering historical data. The story's extended middle section presents Nathaniel's gradual accumulation of evidence that his memories represent actual displacement rather than psychotic break. Physical evidence appears, books in unknown languages he somehow understands, technical diagrams for devices serving unclear purposes, knowledge of historical events that hadn't occurred during his amnesia period, but which he somehow knows. Other cases emerge, individuals across history experiencing similar consciousness displacement, their testimonies preserved in obscure medical literature or religious texts where they're dismissed as delusions. The accumulation creates terrible certainty. Something with access to all time has been borrowing human consciousness for cosmic research purposes. Individuals selected and used without consent because consent assumes importance to entities operating across deep time. The Australian expedition provides concrete validation of metaphysical horror. Nathaniel journeys to remote desert where his Yithian memories suggest ruins of Great Race City should exist, and discovers exactly what he remembered. Cyclopean stone structures built according to architecture his 20th century mind lacks framework to understand. Corridors containing traces of script matching languages he learned during displacement. The ruins span strata indicating occupation across millions of years, predating dinosaurs and extending to era when Earth's dominant life forms bore no relationship to current taxonomy. This transforms cosmic horror from abstract principle to physical fact. Here is evidence that Earth was occupied by intelligence, operating at timescales that make human civilization seem instantaneous, and that intelligence treated consciousness as transferable commodity for information gathering. The climax descends into darkness, both literal and epistemological, as Nathaniel explores deep archives beneath ruins and encounters what great race feared: the elder things, or flying polyps, that eventually drove them to project consciousness forward into future bodies. These entities exist as wind or sound, or something for which human perception lacks adequate categories, killing through processes Nathaniel's senses cannot reliably report. His escape represents triumph of survival, but catastrophic failure of understanding. He knows he encountered something, but cannot definitively describe what. His consciousness having touched reality so alien that even experiencing it directly provides insufficient basis for coherent account. The manuscript he composes afterward exists as evidence that something happened, while simultaneously demonstrating that some experiences resist translation into language structured around human categories. The story's philosophical devastation operates through temporal dislocation rather than spatial alienation. Cthulhu disturbs by sleeping beneath ocean, but oceans can be navigated, depths eventually plumbed. The great race disturbs by existing across all of time, making past and future equally present to consciousness that perceives temporally, rather than experiencing sequential moments. Human identity depends on continuous subjective experience from birth to death, memory creating narrative self that persists through change. But if consciousness can be displaced across time, stored in archive while alien mind occupies one's body, then that persistent self becomes fiction, useful organizing principle but not actual fact about consciousness's nature. The entity that disturbs most profoundly isn't the great race itself, but what they reveal: mind as pattern rather than substance, identity as temporary rather than essential, and time as dimension that can be navigated the way humans navigate space. The story thus demonstrates cosmic horror operating through epistemological rather than physical violation. Nathaniel's body remains unharmed throughout displacement. His consciousness returns intact with additional knowledge of cosmic history. But the experience destroys his confidence in persistent self, reveals human consciousness as vulnerable to displacement by forces operating at scales where individual lives matter only as brief data sources, and demonstrates that vast intelligence can exist indifferent to human autonomy, not through malice, but through operating under logic, where consent becomes meaningless category. The thin connection to Azathoth appears in references to cosmic forces that exist beyond even great races' comprehensive knowledge. Suggestions that their archives document entities operating at scales that even temporal mastery cannot adequately describe. The most disturbing entity remains the one that makes even the great race, beings who conquered time itself, appear as temporary and limited as humans appear to them. August Derleth's posthumous systematization of Lovecraft's mythology, beginning with stories published in the 1940s and culminating in his posthumous collaborations, fundamentally transformed the cosmic horror framework by imposing good versus evil structure explicitly rejected by Lovecraft's philosophical materialism. Derleth categorized entities as elder gods, benevolent, versus old ones, malevolent, assigned them elemental associations, Cthulhu as water, Hastur as air, and structured mythology around cosmic conflict where humanity could potentially appeal to good forces for protection against evil ones. This provided narrative clarity and conventional moral framework, but evacuated the existential horror that made Lovecraft's entities disturbing. Azathoth transformed from blind idiot god, representing cosmic indifference, into defeatable enemy that benevolent cosmic forces theoretically oppose. The damage this revision inflicted appears most clearly in Derleth's The Lurker at the Threshold, 1945. Marketed as collaboration with Lovecraft, but largely Derleth's invention. The story features explicit confrontation between elder gods and outer gods, with humans successfully appealing to benevolent cosmic forces for intervention against malevolent ones. This domesticates cosmic horror by suggesting universe contains moral structure, powerful entities care about human welfare, and proper ritual or knowledge allows accessing protection. Where Lovecraft's horror emerged from recognition that cosmos operates without moral dimension, and vast forces remain utterly indifferent to human existence. Derleth's revision offers consolation that some cosmic powers are benevolent and accessible, effectively returning mythology to conventional supernatural framework where good and evil contend for human souls. Yet some later writers preserved and intensified Lovecraft's philosophical core. Ramsey Campbell's early work, particularly The Inhabitant of the Lake, 1964, and Cold Print, 1969, maintained cosmic indifference while developing distinctive voice that emphasized decay and corruption rather than vastness and alienness. Campbell's entities disturb through implication rather than description, existing at edges of perception where witnessing them requires accepting contamination as price of knowledge. His prose style, ambiguous reference, disorienting shifts in perspective, descriptions that resist parsing, formally enacts the epistemological confusion that Lovecraft described but sometimes undermined through clear, omniscient narration. Campbell recognized that horror of incomprehensibility requires prose that actually resists comprehension rather than clearly describing incomprehensible things. Thomas Ligotti extended cosmic pessimism to explicitly philosophical conclusions that Lovecraft implied but rarely stated baldly. Stories like The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, both essay and thematic foundation for his fiction, articulate cosmic horror's ultimate implication. Consciousness itself constitutes cosmic tragedy, awareness emerging as curse rather than gift, existence worse than non-existence. Ligotti's entities rarely appear directly. Instead, characters recognize puppet-like quality of their own existence, discovering that autonomy and identity represent comforting fictions maintained by consciousness, too limited to recognize its own manipulation. This philosophical horror operates without supernatural elements. Cosmic indifference becomes psychological fact, and the disturbing entity becomes awareness itself. Consciousness recognizing its own contingency and meaninglessness without access to oblivion that would resolve the recognition. The new weird movement of the 1990s to 2000s engaged Lovecraftian themes while explicitly critiquing their racist and reactionary elements. China Miéville's Perdido Street Station, 2000, and subsequent novels feature utterly alien intelligences, the weaver that experiences reality through aesthetic patterns humans cannot perceive, the slake moths that feed on consciousness itself, but contextualize these within urban settings where humans negotiate with rather than simply flee from cosmic otherness. This revision acknowledges Lovecraft's innovation in creating genuinely alien minds while rejecting his assumption that alienness necessarily correlates with horror. Some of Miéville's alien intelligences prove dangerous, others indifferent, some unexpectedly helpful. The key recognition being that otherness doesn't inherently threaten, though it may remain incomprehensible. Laird Barron's contemporary cosmic horror revives Lovecraft's bleakest implications through masculine genre fiction frameworks, noir, adventure, combat narratives that make philosophical devastation more visceral. Stories like The Imago Sequence, 2005, and The Croning, 2012, present protagonists who investigate cosmic mysteries while recognizing investigation itself guarantees contamination. Barron's entities operate across timescales spanning human history, entire bloodlines and civilizations serving as experiments or food sources for intelligences that perceive humanity the way humans perceive bacterial cultures. The horror emerges not from encountering these entities once, but from recognizing their presence has always structured human existence, every supposedly autonomous choice potentially representing manipulation by forces operating through genetic memory and collective unconscious. Academic appropriation transformed Lovecraft from pulp writer to subject of serious philosophical analysis. S.T. Joshi's definitive biography, H.P. Lovecraft, A Life, 1996, established scholarly framework for studying Lovecraft's work. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, analyzes cosmic horror's philosophical implications, connecting Lovecraftian themes to medieval mysticism's concept of divine darkness and contemporary speculative realism's object-oriented ontology. Graham Harmon's Weird Realism, 2012, positions Lovecraft as inadvertent philosopher whose fictional entities embody key concepts in contemporary ontology, particularly the idea that objects possess reality exceeding any relation or perception, that things withdraw from full accessibility even as they interact with other things. These scholarly readings recognized what Derleth's systematization obscured. Azathoth and similar entities function as philosophical propositions about reality's structure rather than fantasy monsters. The blind idiot god represents not character in mythology, but thought experiment about what cosmic indifference would look like if taken seriously. Not malevolent force to be opposed, but operating principle to be recognized. Contemporary philosophy's speculative realism and object-oriented ontology essentially rediscovered through academic language what Lovecraft explored through horror fiction. That human consciousness provides no privileged access to reality, that vast domains of existence operate without reference to human concerns, that correlation between thought and thing represents contingent rather than necessary relationship. The evolution across these interpretations reveals tension at cosmic horror's core. The most disturbing entity resists narrative development because narrative assumes protagonists, conflicts, resolutions. Later writers either domesticated the horror through conventional structures, Derleth's good versus evil, or abandoned narrative satisfaction for philosophical honesty, Ligotti's pessimistic consciousness studies. The entity succeeds as philosophical provocation, but resists successful translation into conventional story, which explains both Lovecraft's fragmentary approaches and later writers' struggles to extend, rather than merely reference his innovations. The blind idiot god at Cosmic Center disturbs precisely because it cannot be defeated, understood, or even adequately described. It can only be recognized as operating principle, and that recognition constitutes the horror rather than beginning of heroic quest to oppose or comprehend it. The Necronomicon achieved existence through collective desire for cosmic horror to escape fiction into reality. multiple hoax editions emerging in the 1970s to 1980s to satisfy readers who wanted Lovecraft's invented grimoire to exist as actual occult text. The most influential hoax, the Simon Necronomicon, published in 1977, combined Sumerian mythology with Lovecraftian references, presenting itself as translation of authentic ancient text discovered through occult scholarship. The book sold hundreds of thousands of copies despite, or because of, its obvious fabrication, readers treating obviously invented rituals as functional magical practice. This created peculiar recursive loop. Fictional text inspires hoax claiming to be real version of fictional text, which then influences actual occult practice, generating real magical tradition derived from consciously fabricated fiction. The psychology driving these hoaxes reveals something profound about cosmic horror's cultural function. Lovecraft explicitly designed his mythology as fiction, regularly breaking the fourth wall in letters to discuss his invented entities as literary devices. Yet readers persistently want the fiction to be real, searching for evidence that Azathoth or Cthulhu or Yog-Sothoth exist independently of Lovecraft's imagination. This desire manifests not as simple gullibility, but as a response to secular modernity's disenchantment. The recognition that scientific materialism has evacuated mystery from cosmos, replacing numinous with mechanical, sacred with statistical. Cosmic horror offers re-enchantment through dread rather than wonder, suggesting universe contains forces that exceed human comprehension, even if those forces remain utterly indifferent to human existence. Chaos magic adopted Lovecraftian entities as operational tools in the 1980s to 1990s, practitioners arguing that fictional entities can function as effectively as traditional deities for ritual purposes, because all religious symbolism represents human projection rather than contact with actual transcendent beings. Peter Carroll's Liber Null and Psychonaut, 1987, and Phil Hines' Condensed Chaos, 1995, explicitly incorporated Cthulhu Mythos entities into magical practice, treating Azathoth as meditative focus for dissolution of ego rather than actual cosmic principle. This appropriation inverted Lovecraft's materialism, where he used cosmic indifference to undermine supernatural belief. Chaos magicians used his entities to practice magic, while acknowledging those entities' fictional status. The technique works precisely because it doesn't require belief in entities' objective existence, only willingness to use them as psychological tools. Internet culture amplified these dynamics through creepypasta and true encounter narratives that present Lovecraftian experiences as actual events. Forums dedicated to Cthulhu sightings or Necronomicon research maintain ambiguous relationship with reality. Participants sometimes role-playing sincere belief and sometimes acknowledging performative nature of claims, while nevertheless treating mythology as framework for interpreting genuinely unsettling experiences. A Reddit post describing strange dreams involving non-Euclidean geometry might be creative fiction, genuine sleep disorder, or something in between. Participant experiencing actual neurological phenomenon and interpreting it through Lovecraftian framework that provides vocabulary for otherwise inchoate disturbance. Antarctic mysteries generate persistent conspiracy theories, connecting actual geography to At the Mountains of Madness, enthusiasts pointing to Nazi expeditions, unexplained seismic readings, and satellite imagery anomalies as potential evidence for ancient non-human civilization beneath ice. These theories ignore that Lovecraft invented his Antarctic horrors decades before comprehensive mapping of the continent. but they reveal desire to find cosmic horror in reality's margins, places where human knowledge remains incomplete and imagination can project terrors that scientific explanation hasn't yet displaced. The attraction isn't evidence-based belief, but aesthetic satisfaction of treating familiar geography as potentially harboring cosmic otherness, everyday world as thin membrane, separating mundane existence from alien realities. The psychology of wanting cosmic horror to be real reflects complex relationship with meaninglessness. Lovecraft's philosophy suggests human existence serves no cosmic purpose. Consciousness emerged accidentally. Universe operates without moral dimension. This recognition should devastate. Yet, readers actively seek out fiction that reinforces these conclusions and then attempt to validate that fiction as reality. The apparent paradox resolves when recognizing that cosmic horror offers specific consolations despite its bleakness. If vast, incomprehensible forces exist, then human existence gains significance through relationship to those forces, even if that relationship consists of being cosmically insignificant. Better to exist as briefly noticed by indifferent God than to exist in universe where nothing notices because nothing exists beyond material processes. The hoaxes and sightings and conspiracy theories represent attempt to populate materialist cosmos with something, even something utterly indifferent, rather than accept emptiness all the way down. This explains why Azathoth specifically attracts mystical appropriation, despite representing the entity least amenable to religious interpretation. The blind idiot god offers nothing, no wisdom, no power, no purpose. Yet, practitioners meditate on its image, invoke its name, construct rituals supposedly contacting its influence. These practices function as controlled encounter with meaninglessness, structured way of confronting cosmic indifference without succumbing to despair or nihilism. By treating Azathoth as entity that can be approached, practitioners domesticate the horror while preserving enough unsettling otherness to feel they're engaging something beyond comfortable human frameworks. The entity becomes paradoxically meaningful through its embodiment of meaninglessness, object of contemplation, precisely because it represents what resists contemplation. The persistence of these hoaxes and legends demonstrates Lovecraft's entities escaping authorial intent to become genuine cultural mythology, not believed literally by most participants, but functioning as shared framework for articulating experiences of cosmic alienation, epistemological uncertainty, and confrontation with indifference. When someone describes unsettling dream using language of non-Euclidean spaces, or claims to have glimpsed something that matches description of Azathoth's court, they're not necessarily lying or deluded. They're using available cultural vocabulary to communicate genuinely disturbing experience, and Lovecraftian mythology provides richer language for certain types of existential disturbance than either scientific or traditional religious frameworks offer. The fiction becomes real not as objective fact, but as lived cultural category, framework through which people interpret and communicate experiences that resist other forms of articulation. Cosmic horror resists cinematic adaptation, precisely because visualization domesticates what should remain incomprehensible, transforming abstract dread into concrete and therefore limited special effects. The few successful film adaptations succeed by refusing to show the entity directly, or by making visual representation itself a source of horror through its inadequacy. John Carpenter's The Thing, 1982, though not Lovecraft adaptation, captures cosmic horror's essence through alien life that violates categorical boundaries, neither individual organism nor collective, reproducing through imitation that makes identity uncertain, existing according to biology that has no terrestrial precedent. The horror emerges not from the creature's appearance, but from recognition that it operates under logic incompatible with human frameworks for distinguishing self from other, living from dead, real from imitation. Alex Garland's Annihilation, 2018, translates cosmic horror to film through the shimmer, zone where physical laws mutate, biology recombines according to alien aesthetics, and human identity becomes unstable through cellular transformation. The entity generating the shimmer operates without malice or intention, simply refracting reality through principles that make Earth's biology appear as raw material for experimentation. The film's climax refuses conventional confrontation, instead presenting protagonists' encounter with alien intelligence as dance that transforms both participants, knowledge flowing between them without either achieving understanding of others' ontological status. This captures Lovecraftian recognition that some encounters don't resolve into triumph or defeat, but into mutual transformation that leaves human consciousness fundamentally altered without clear assessment whether that alteration represents contamination or evolution. Richard Stanley's Color, Out of Space, 2019, demonstrates how cosmic horror can translate to film when filmmakers embrace rather than resist incomprehensibility. The entity arrives as color beyond visible spectrum, its physical manifestations disturbing precisely because they violate expectations about how matter should behave. Family dog fusing with sun, time flowing differently in contaminated zones, consciousness remaining aware during bodily dissolution. The film's hallucinatory visual style enacts the epistemological breakdown character's experience, conventional spatial and temporal continuity dissolving as alien presence penetrates deeper into family's reality. Success comes from making the film itself feel contaminated by what it depicts. Form reflecting content through disorienting editing and impossible color palettes. Video games achieve cosmic horror's effects more successfully than film through interactive medium's capacity to make players complicit in knowledge gathering that destroys understanding. Bloodborne, 2015, structures entire game around progressive revelation that transforms straightforward monster hunting narrative into encounter with cosmic entities operating at scales where human consciousness appears as larvae or food source. Players literally enact the Lovecraftian protagonist's journey from ignorance through partial knowledge to recognition that exceeds sanity. Game's mechanics evolving to reflect protagonist's transformation from human hunter to something that perceives cosmic truth at cost of remaining recognizably human. The insight statistic tracks this progression. Higher values revealing previously invisible entities while making character more vulnerable to specific attacks. Knowledge as contamination rendered as gameplay mechanic. Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, 2002. Mechanized madness through sanity effects that break fourth wall, making players uncertain whether disturbing events occur within game world or represent the game itself malfunctioning. Screen goes black with false video cable disconnected message. Game appears to delete save files. Volume adjusts itself. Camera angles become impossible. These effects create genuine uncertainty about what constitutes game reality versus glitch versus intentional disruption, enacting at player level the epistemological collapse characters experience when cosmic horror penetrates their understanding of what's real. The game treats players' meta-knowledge, awareness of being player rather than character, as vulnerable to same disruption that threatens characters' sanity. Tabletop role-playing game Call of Cthulhu, first edition, 1981, continuously updated since, systematized Lovecraftian horror through mechanics that make character deterioration inevitable rather than preventable. Unlike heroic RPGs, where characters grow more powerful through experience, Call of Cthulhu characters accumulate psychological trauma, their sanity eroding through encounters with cosmic truth, regardless of player decisions. The game's structure acknowledges what Lovecraft's fiction implies. You cannot win against cosmic indifference. Only choose how awareness destroys you. Successful campaigns end with characters dead, institutionalized, or fundamentally transformed into something no longer recognizably human. Victory consists of solving mystery before complete psychological collapse, rather than defeating cosmic forces. Heavy metal and doom metal adopted Lovecraftian imagery as aesthetic foundation. Bands like Electric Wizard building entire discographies around cosmic horror themes. Their album Dope Throne 2000 features lyrics describing worship of sleeping gods, consciousness dissolution through narcotic obliteration, and universe as mechanism grinding human meaning into dust. The music's crushing repetition and glacial tempo formally enact the horror's essence. Not dramatic tension and release, but oppressive weight that continues without variation or relief. Sound itself becoming hostile environment, rather than artistic expression seeking audience approval. This represents musical translation of Azathoth's senseless piping, rhythm stripped of purpose or development, pattern that continues because stopping would require intention the pattern doesn't possess. Black metal's philosophical alignment with cosmic nihilism appears in bands that embrace Lovecraftian cosmicism as alternative to genres, traditional Satanism. Where Satan represents rebellion against divine order, Lovecraftian entities represent recognition that no divine order exists to rebel against, making Satanism seem quaintly anthropocentric. Bands incorporating this recognition produce music emphasizing annihilation of self, rather than glorification of individual will. Their aesthetic violence directed at consciousness itself as source of suffering that oblivion would resolve. This inverts typical heavy music's empowerment narrative, instead offering dissolution as aesthetically and philosophically preferable to continued awareness in meaningless cosmos. These adaptations succeed when they recognize cosmic horror's fundamental challenge. The most disturbing entity cannot be depicted, only gestured toward through effects it produces on reality and consciousness. Film, games, and music that embrace this limitation, making form enact disruption rather than representing disruption through conventional narrative, achieve genuine translation of Lovecraftian dread to new media. The entity remains absent from direct portrayal, its presence felt through contamination of medium itself, and that absence made present captures what visualization would necessarily fail to achieve. Gothic and horror subcultures absorbed Lovecraftian mythology as aesthetic framework distinct from traditional vampire and ghost imagery, enthusiasts treating cosmic indifference as philosophical position rather than entertainment trope. The iconography appears in fashion, visual art, tattoos, tentacles, and non-Euclidean geometry rendered as decorative elements that signal membership in community defined by comfort with meaninglessness. This seems paradoxical. Why would people embrace aesthetics of cosmic horror, imagery designed to evoke dread at universe's indifference? The answer reveals subculture's function as controlled encounter with disturbing truths, wearing Azathoth imagery serving as constant reminder of cosmic insignificance that wearer has acknowledged and integrated rather than suppressed or denied. Academic philosophy discovered Lovecraft as inadvertent contributor to contemporary ontological debates, particularly speculative realism's challenge to correlationism. The assumption that philosophy can only discuss relationship between thought and world, rather than world in itself independent of human consciousness. Graham Harman's Weird Realism, Lovecraft and Philosophy, 2012, Positions. Lovecraft's entities as literary embodiment of objects that withdraw from full accessibility, things that possess reality exceeding any relation or perception. Azathoth represents ultimate withdrawn object, entity, whose reality cannot be reduced to its effects on human consciousness or its position in cosmic hierarchy. Something that exists in excess of every possible description. This philosophical reading validates what literary critics often dismissed as pulp excess, recognizing that Lovecraft's stylistic tendency toward inadequate description reflects genuine philosophical insight about limits of correlation between mind and reality. Eugene Thacker's In the Dust of This Planet, 2011, analyzes cosmic horror as meditation on the world without us, planet that existed before humanity and will continue after extinction, cosmos that operates without reference to human concerns. Thacker connects Lovecraftian themes to medieval mysticism's negative theology, particularly Pseudo-Dionysius's descriptions of divine darkness that exceeds positive knowledge. Both traditions recognize something that exists beyond human comprehension, but where mysticism preserves hope for eventual union with incomprehensible divine. Cosmic horror offers only recognition that incomprehensible remains forever alien. The comparison illuminates what makes Lovecraftian entities specifically modern horror. They occupy a position where transcendence should provide meaning, but instead reveal transcendence as indifferent to human meaning-making. Object-oriented ontology finds in Lovecraft's entities examples of its core claim that objects possess autonomous reality independent of relations to other objects or human perception. When Lovecraft describes Cthulhu as existing whether humans perceive it or not, when he suggests cosmic forces operate according to principles bearing no necessary relationship to human cognition, he's articulating position that contemporary philosophy has developed through technical vocabulary. The entities function as thought experiments, demonstrating that things exist in ways that exceed their availability to consciousness. That correlation between thought and thing represents contingent rather than necessary relationship. That vast domains of reality operate without requiring human witness or comprehension. China Miéville and the New Weird movement engaged Lovecraft while explicitly critiquing his reactionary politics and racist anxiety about miscegenation and cultural contamination. Miéville's Perdido Street Station, 2000, features genuinely alien intelligences, the weaver experiencing reality through aesthetic patterns humans cannot perceive, the slake moths feeding directly on consciousness, but contextualizes these within cosmopolitan urban setting, where negotiation with otherness becomes possibility rather than guaranteed horror. This revision acknowledges Lovecraft's innovation in creating truly alien minds, while rejecting assumption that alienness necessarily correlates with threat. Some entities prove dangerous, others strange but navigable, some unexpectedly cooperative given proper frameworks for interaction. The key recognition: otherness doesn't inherently horrify once separated from xenophobic assumption that difference equals danger. Thomas Ligotti extended cosmic pessimism to explicit philosophical conclusions in both fiction and essay, particularly The Conspiracy Against the Human Race, 2010, which argues consciousness itself constitutes evolutionary mistake, awareness emerging as cosmic tragedy rather than achievement. Ligotti's work represents Lovecraftian themes stripped of genre conventions. No tentacled monsters or ancient grimoires, just philosophical recognition that existence exceeds justification. Consciousness creates suffering through awareness that non-conscious matter avoids, and the most honest response to cosmic truth involves acknowledging that being constitutes burden rather than gift. This philosophical horror operates without supernatural elements, cosmic indifference becoming psychological fact that no amount of meaning-making successfully refutes. Scholarly work on Lovecraft proliferated dramatically after S.T. Joshi's definitive biography, H.P. Lovecraft, A Life, 1996, established serious critical framework. Academic journals published analyses of Lovecraft's philosophical influences, his relationship to scientific materialism, his inadvertent contributions to phenomenology and ontology. This scholarly attention validated what genre fans always recognized. Lovecraft wasn't just pulp entertainer, but philosophical writer using horror fiction to explore implications of materialist cosmology, scientific worldview, and human consciousness's peripheral status in vast, indifferent universe. The academic legitimization didn't domesticate the horror, but provided tools for articulating why it disturbs at levels deeper than conventional monster stories. These appropriations demonstrate cosmic horror's flexibility as cultural framework, its capacity to function as aesthetic choice, philosophical position, political critique, and existential meditation simultaneously. The most disturbing entity persists across these contexts precisely because it resists reduction to single interpretation. Azathoth can represent object-oriented ontology's withdrawn object, negative theology's incomprehensible absolute, existentialist recognition of meaninglessness, or simply really effective horror imagery depending on context and purpose. This multiplicity reflects the entity's fundamental nature, something that exists in excess of any particular description, meaning different things across different frameworks while retaining core disturbing implication that human meaning-making represents provincial activity with no cosmic validity. Cosmic indifference disturbs more profoundly in secular age precisely because modernity evacuated traditional consolations while leaving consciousness intact to recognize its own insignificance without supernatural compensation. Pre-modern worldviews offered divine purpose, cosmic meaning, individual souls that mattered to universe itself. Scientific materialism demonstrated these beliefs' inadequacy without providing replacement frameworks for generating meaning that survive honest assessment of humanity's cosmic position. Lovecraft's entities embody this dilemma. They represent what scientific worldview implies. When pursued to its logical conclusions, cosmos operating through impersonal mechanisms at scales rendering human concerns statistically negligible, consciousness emerging as side effect of processes that neither require nor privilege awareness. The entity functions as metaphor for existential risks that exceed human capacity to address through individual or collective action. Climate change operates at planetary scale across timescales spanning centuries, its mechanisms indifferent to human suffering. It generates, its resolution requiring coordination beyond what current political structures enable. Nuclear weapons represent knowledge that cannot be unlearned, destructive capacity that persists regardless of whether humanity chooses wisdom or catastrophe. Artificial intelligence development potentially creates non-human consciousness operating according to optimization pressures, bearing no necessary alignment with human values or survival. Each of these threats mirrors cosmic horror structure, vast processes humans initiated but cannot control. operating according to logic that makes human meaning irrelevant, threatening existence while remaining fundamentally indifferent to that existence's value. Contemporary philosophy engages Lovecraftian themes because they articulate experiences increasingly common in globalized technological society. Feeling of operating within systems too complex to comprehend, recognition that individual agency matters less than structural forces, awareness that meaning emerges from human projection rather than cosmic validation. The blind idiot God at cosmic center becomes metaphor for capitalism's impersonal mechanisms, technological acceleration's momentum beyond democratic control, information networks that exceed any individual's capacity to survey or understand. These aren't supernatural horrors, but actual features of contemporary existence, and cosmic horror provides vocabulary for articulating disturbance they generate, without lapsing into conspiracy, thinking that would restore comforting agency, even if malevolent. Yet the appeal of cosmic horror suggests complex relationship with meaninglessness rather than simple despair. Readers actively seek out fiction that reinforces bleakest conclusions about human insignificance, finding aesthetic satisfaction in narratives that offer no consolation or heroic triumph. This seems paradoxical until recognizing that cosmic horror provides specific pleasures, the satisfaction of confronting difficult truths rather than maintaining comfortable delusions, the aesthetic appeal of vast scales and alien perspectives, the perverse comfort of recognizing that one's personal failures pale beside cosmic indifference to all human endeavor. The genre offers what absurdist philosophy recommends: clear-eyed recognition of meaninglessness without denial or escapism, while packaging that recognition as entertainment. The therapeutic versus paralyzing function of cosmic dread depends on individual psychology and cultural context. For some readers, Lovecraftian recognition that human meaning represents provincial projection liberates from anxiety about living up to cosmic purpose or divine plan. If nothing matters at cosmic scale, then one can construct local meaning without guilt that it fails to align with transcendent truth. For others, same recognition generates nihilistic paralysis, the conviction that action serves no purpose if cosmos operates with indifference to all human choice. The entity disturbs differently depending on whether recognition of meaninglessness destroys motivation or paradoxically enables freedom from cosmic obligation. Philosophically, engagement with the most disturbing entity in Lovecraft's mythology forces confrontation with hard problem of meaning. Can consciousness generate legitimate values in universe that provides no validation for those values? Or does cosmic indifference ultimately render all human meaning-making arbitrary and therefore meaningless? Existentialism answered yes to first question. Sartre's existence precedes essence. Camus' absurd hero, creating meaning through rebellion against meaningless cosmos. But Lovecraftian horror presses harder, asking whether even that existential meaning-making might represent comforting self-deception. Consciousness convincing itself that projected values possess legitimacy when cosmic perspective reveals them as provincial accidents with no significance beyond brief moment they're maintained. The entity remains disturbing because it offers no resolution to this question. Traditional horror allows catharsis through defeat of threat or escape from danger. Cosmic horror, structured around entity as principle, offers neither. You cannot defeat principle of cosmic indifference, cannot escape from universe's actual structure, cannot unlearn recognition once achieved. The horror persists because accurate understanding provides no basis for action, no framework for living with truth, that consciousness cannot successfully integrate while maintaining function. This creates permanent tension between knowledge that disturbs and psychological need for operating frameworks that require ignorance or denial of that knowledge's full implications. Perhaps the deepest recognition concerns consciousness itself as both curse and temporary condition. Awareness allows recognition of cosmic insignificance, but provides no tools for bearing that recognition without psychological collapse. The entity that exists as cosmic substrate makes this tension cosmically literal. We're conscious patterns within larger pattern that operates according to principles making consciousness appear as local anomaly, awareness that emerged accidentally and will dissolve inevitably. The horror isn't that we'll be destroyed, but that we already exist within the entity we fear, consciousness representing brief local phenomenon within larger indifference. Every thought we have occurring as pattern, the cosmic substrate sustains until the moment it stops. We cannot encounter what we've always existed inside of, and recognition of that inside constitutes the horror that never resolves, because it describes actual rather than imagined condition.